There was an airline that operated across Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. It had pilots, mechanics, cargo manifests, a headquarters, and a payroll. It flew thousands of missions. It carried passengers, supplies, and equipment across some of the most remote and dangerous terrain on Earth. It had one unusual feature. It did not officially exist. It was owned, funded, and operated by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States government. It was called Air America. And what it carried, on certain routes at certain times, with the knowledge of certain men in Washington, was opium. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented historical record. Welcome to Saigon Files. Episode 5. Air America. Air America was born out of an earlier CIA operation called Civil Air Transport, established after World War II to support nationalist Chinese forces. By the early 1960s, as American involvement in Southeast Asia deepened, the CIA restructured and expanded the operation into what became Air America, a fully functional commercial-looking airline with one classified owner. At its peak, Air America operated more than 200 aircraft and employed over 5,000 people. It flew cargo, troops, relief supplies, and intelligence operatives across Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. In the remote mountain regions of Laos, where the CIA was running a secret war against communist Pathet Lao forces, entirely outside congressional oversight, Air America was the only reliable connection between isolated Hmong villages and the outside world. The CIA's alliance with the Hmong people of Laos was one of the most significant covert operations of the Cold War era. The Hmong were fierce fighters, deeply anti-communist, and willing to bear casualties that American political realities made impossible for US forces to sustain. The CIA trained them, armed them, funded them, and built its entire Laotian strategy around them. There was one problem. The Hmong economy, particularly in the remote highland regions where the most effective fighters lived, was built around opium. It was the primary cash crop. It was how families survived. It was the economic foundation of the entire society. And the CIA, in choosing to build its alliance on the Hmong, had chosen to build it on opium. The question that historian Alfred McCoy spent years researching, and that congressional investigators would eventually pursue, was not whether the CIA knew about the opium. It knew. The question was what it did about it. And the documented answer is, it flew it. Alfred McCoy's 1972 book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, was the first systematic investigation of CIA involvement in the Southeast Asian drug trade. McCoy was a doctoral student at Yale when he began the research. He travelled to Laos, Vietnam, and France. He interviewed opium farmers, drug traffickers, diplomats, and intelligence operatives. What he found was a supply chain with the CIA embedded at critical points along it. McCoy documented that Air America aircraft transported opium from Hmong poppy-growing regions in the Laotian highlands to collection points closer to processing facilities. The CIA's position, when the matter became impossible to ignore, was that individual pilots may have carried opium as a personal favour to Hmong allies, and that this was not official policy. McCoy's research challenged that framing. The scale, he argued, was too large and too consistent to be explained by individual freelancing. The CIA was aware of his research before publication. An agency officer travelled to Southeast Asia ahead of McCoy's reporting trip, reportedly to discourage sources from speaking with him. The publisher received legal inquiries. McCoy published anyway. The book was reviewed in major publications, entered the academic record, and its core findings have since been supported by declassified government documents and subsequent scholarly research. The processed heroin that moved through these networks did not stay in Southeast Asia. It travelled. Through South Vietnam, where distribution networks were controlled in part by figures within the South Vietnamese government, the United States was spending billions defending. Through Hong Kong, and eventually through channels that intelligence analysts tracked and documented, into the veins of American soldiers stationed in the country the CIA was supposedly trying to save. To be precise about what the documented record shows and does not show, there is no evidence that the CIA deliberately targeted American soldiers with heroin. What the record shows is that the agency made a calculated decision to prioritize Cold War objectives over drug interdiction, and that the consequences of that decision fell, with devastating force, on the 19-year-old boys it was sharing a theatre of war with. The question of who knew what and when has been the subject of congressional investigations, declassified document reviews, and decades of academic research. The picture that emerges is not one of a single dramatic decision made in a single room. It is something more mundane and more disturbing. A series of accommodations, each one individually defensible, that accumulated into a policy of willful blindness. CIA station chiefs in Laos knew their Hmong allies grew and traded opium. They reported this up the chain. The reports were received, filed, and the operations continued. Military attaches in Vietnam were aware of the heroin flooding the market outside American bases. Reports were written. The reports were received. The operations continued. There is a specific document in the historical record that illustrates how this silence was maintained. In 1971, a Defense Intelligence Agency report identified by name senior figures in the South Vietnamese government who were directly involved in heroin distribution to American troops. The report was classified. It was not acted upon. The named individuals continued to hold their positions in the government that American soldiers were dying to defend. The reason was not incompetence. The reason was priority. The Cold War logic that governed every decision in Southeast Asia during this period held that anti-communist allies were too valuable to sacrifice over drug enforcement. A Hmong general who could field 10,000 fighters against the Pathet Lao was worth more to American strategic objectives than the interdiction of the opium his economy depended on. A South Vietnamese official who delivered political stability, or the appearance of it, was worth more than the disruption of his criminal enterprises. The soldiers outside the gates buying $5 heroin packets were not part of that calculation. They were not a strategic asset. They were a cost. And in the accounting of Cold War geopolitics, costs were acceptable as long as the objectives were achieved. The men who made these decisions were not monsters. They were bureaucrats and strategists operating inside a framework that measured human beings in terms of their utility to political objectives. That is in some ways more disturbing than if they had been monsters. Monsters are rare. Bureaucratic indifference is not. In the decades since the Vietnam War ended, the documentary record around CIA involvement in the Southeast Asian drug trade has expanded significantly. The Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that investigated CIA activities in the mid-1970s, examined aspects of the agency's relationships with drug trafficking allies. Its findings were substantial but incomplete, limited by classification and the agency's considerable capacity for institutional self-protection. Subsequent declassification has filled in portions of the picture. A 1989 Senate subcommittee investigation into drug trafficking and foreign policy, led by Senator John Kerry, documented in granular detail the ways in which Cold War priorities had repeatedly trumped drug enforcement across multiple theaters and multiple decades. The Kerry Committee report runs to thousands of pages. It is thorough, it is sourced, and it received almost no sustained public attention when it was released. Alfred McCoy continued his research for decades after the politics of heroin. His work expanded to cover CIA involvement in drug trafficking across multiple regions and multiple conflicts. By the time his revised and expanded edition appeared in 1991, the documentary foundation for his core arguments had grown from the primary source interviews of a doctoral student into a substantial academic record supported by declassified government documents that had not existed when he first published. What the full record shows, Vietnam, Laos, the Golden Triangle, the unmarked white plains on jungle airstrips, is not a government that set out to addict its own soldiers. It is a government that set out to win a Cold War and made a series of decisions, each one individually justified by the logic of the moment, that together produced an outcome nobody in the decision chain was willing to own. The opium moved because the alliance required it. The heroin flooded because the market allowed it. The soldiers bought it because the army's own crackdown on marijuana made it the rational choice. The addicted veterans came home because the war ended. And the CIA's airline flew on, its white planes landing and taking off from jungle airstrips, carrying cargo that official records declined to specify, serving objectives that official policy declined to acknowledge. Air America ceased operations in 1976, 1 year after the fall of Saigon. Its aircraft were sold, its records were classified, its pilots scattered into civilian aviation. The company that officially did not exist was officially dissolved, and the paper trail that documented what it had carried was folded into the archive of things the government knew and chose not to say. But the archive exists. The researchers found it. The documents were declassified. The record is there for anyone willing to read it. And what it says, in the dry language of government files and congressional testimony and academic footnotes, is this: the CIA knew, the opium flew, the soldiers paid the price, and for a very long time, nobody was supposed to find out. Next episode, the soldiers who never made it home, and the families who spent decades trying to find out why. Episode 6 of Saigon Files. America forgot them. If this story deserves to be told, subscribe, because we are just getting started